I'm Alex Morrison. I am from AWS and I am a senior responsible AI practitioner. What my team does at AWS is we have the express focus of partnering with our customers on their responsible AI journey. And we built this team to respond to the needs of our customer, leveraging our services.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Dia Nguyen, and I am the Senior Practice Manager for the Responsible AI team, and we sit in emerging technologies and intelligent platforms. And as Alex described, a good part of our work is first education and helping to increase awareness of the value and importance of us building inclusively and responsibly. And and then the other piece of this is actually working with our customers to help them on their responsible AI journey, help with them unpack and understand where there is potential risk, and then work with them to put those principles into practice. What things do they need to actually have instantiated in their organization in order to be able to ensure that they're mitigating risk and then building in an inclusive and responsible way? So we're excited to be able to talk to you today because I know this is a little different. You might be saying, why are we having a conversation about responsible AI in the midst of cloud security and thinking about cybersecurity? But there's some real implications or considerations that we believe that teams, as they start to employ AI to help solve some of the challenges that we're seeing in security, that they need to be take into consideration as well. And so that's what this discussion will be about today. With that, I will take a seat for a couple of moments and allow Alex to start off, and then I'll be back with you in a little bit.
Thank you, Dia. So I want you to take a moment to read this, for this is going to be the basics of our discussion this evening. So just want you to sink in and then have this be where we're going to jump off from. So what today's cybersecurity solutions have to do is we have to navigate the ever-growing internet. We have to do it effectively, and we monitor the traffic. We have timely events that we have to make sure we stay on top of and detect. There are multi-directional risks that we have to continue to monitor. And we also have to look at the increased issues and manage those as they come. And with that said, building responsibility or building responsible is not at the forefront because all these things are coming at us fairly quickly. So due to the advancements, we are analyzing and improving cybersecurity, and it's no longer a human scale problem. AI-based tools have emerged to support security teams and reduce risks efficiently and effectively. Oh, I'm sorry, I went a little bit too fast. So what happens at that point when we have to move so quickly is that analysis tension comes into play, because then we have to define a defense approach. We have to move quickly and with urgency to do this. We must operate in concert with other humans, and we must support overall risk and management. So the challenges that brings, where we have an AI-driven cyber solution, is that we have human assumptions about security risks. We may not have the right demographics and or cultural groups that are represented in our build process. And then we also have some unconscious bias that could be expose itself through different logic for our security apps like DDoS detection, intrusion prevention, user authentication, and spam filtering. First, I have to share with you, for some reason, my notes are not showing up. So I'm going to go at this raw. So please forgive me if I feel a little nervous all of a sudden, but I can't see my notes. All right. So now that you're right there with me and you can feel me, all right, I'll move on. So with building responsible AI not in the forefront, it brings it brings in a more of an importance of using AI responsibly. And I'm pretty much going to read these things to you because I can't see my notes, so excuse me. So consider how critical it is to use AI responsibly if you want to reduce your cybersecurity risks at scale and keep your logic equitable and equal and unbiased as you're building. So basically what I'm trying to share with you is that as we move really quickly through what we have to do to stay on the defense, we then become hypersensitive to getting the job done and staying in front of the attackers instead of, looking at how we build responsibly, where we should be always in our forefront, building responsible technology and making sure that we're not harming anyone at the end of that. So I'm going to bring Dia back up because I'm going to have you do Mind the Gap, if you don't mind, because I can't see the notes and I know you know this one. So I'm going to bring Dia back up. And I'm going to try to fix this.
Okay. So we have a little bit of a challenge, right? You were hearing a little bit of some of the concerns or risks that are potentially that need to be considered as we think about the rapid increase of the amount of data, the speed with which data is being created, the disparity in the systems, perhaps that have to be monitored, and the data that's coming from that. That sort of gives us, a bit of a challenge that we're now having to grapple with as we look at leveraging AI in ways to be able to handle that data, right? It's able to give us scale and the ability to review data at speeds in which a human cannot do, and hopefully provide insight in ways that will allow us to be much more, or make a shift from being just reactive and looking at things historically to hopefully proactive and being even predictive in terms of considerations that might need to be made for security. So that's kind of the groundwork, right? What Alex was talking about. Now, when we talk about the gap, we have seen and studies are showing that organizations understand that they're risk with using AI, but they're also looking at the great potential or the opportunity that we have in leveraging this technology. And so what then do they do? That's what they're calling the preparedness gap. And Deloitte coined that phrase as being this, I guess, tension or challenge in that organizations know or are beginning to have an understanding or awareness of risk as it relates to leveraging AI and ML and using data more broadly, but being stuck in some ways with either the lack of capability or the readiness to be able to respond and mitigate the risks that are associated. So this is what we call what is being called the preparedness gap. And so then we have a challenge to, one, equip organizations so that they are not just aware of the risks, but also have the tools, the capabilities organizationally to be able to respond. So I fixed it. You want to? So I'm all good. Okay.
So then what we found that McKinsey and Company shared in an article was that organizations then fail to focus on ethical, social, and regulatory implications. And so then we become vulnerable when we move into building our algorithms, and we can build them with bias, and we present other risks, and we can expose ourselves to social and legal consequences. So with that comes some risk and impacts to our company. With reputational damage, it just becomes a erosion of trust, if you will. And when someone has lost trust in you, then the perception of you is negative, and the customer trust erodes, and your sales could be hit up, and and the customer base can be lost. And your revenue then, like I said, could be lost. And then there's an impact again on the customer trust. And then as far as the regulatory repercussions, you can end up with some legal penalties and or if you fail to adhere to the laws, there might be some infringement on rights, and therefore all of that encompasses legal penalties. And then, with that comes liability and legal ramifications. So the gap skills we mentioned is not the only issue to responsible AI adoption. There is complexity. And responsible AI has crossed multiple teams and disciplines. And it's more than the technology. It involves the economics, the moral philosophy, the law, the social science. The skills and experience to tackle these problems are not present in most enterprises. And so this brings you to some companies have to begin to establish a basic awareness of the problems associated with responsible AI. And in some cases, companies don't have the required skills or experience to make sure that we can tackle this problem in a comprehensive manner. Now, at AWS, we, in our department, in our area, we have pillars of responsible AI that we are following as far as our team and the company goes. And so I'm going to bring Dia up to walk you through these. Dia? Pillars.
So this is a framework, and it's not unlike many other frameworks that you might have seen. I think there are some over 100 different frameworks that exist today that actually provide some ethical, trustworthy, or responsible AI principles that have been created. Our framework is not much different. We think about this framework similar to what you might have heard of when we talk about well-architected. Our well-architected framework is one that we say, if you follow and go across the pillars, these are the areas that we believe organizations should be paying attention to, the most important areas, in order to ensure that they're able to get the greatest value out of the cloud and operate effectively when they're moving workloads to the cloud. The same is true about this structure, this framework for us. It is one of the ways, or a tool that we use to help us in guiding our customers through considering the things that are important for them to be able to build a foundation, to ensure that they're building and operating responsibly and inclusively. So I'll take a few moments for us to be able to talk through this framework and the context to help you all understand why these are the pillars that we focus on, and then what that might look like as we start to think about that in the way in which we may be deploying AI to leverage in cybersecurity situations. So the first is value alignment. And this may sound obvious, right? We think about strategy for AI or strategy for any of our technology. We would want our strategy and structure to help or align with our values, the company's intended mission, what they're stating is their goal and objectives. And so that's no different in this particular case when we think about that. But the lens that we like people to consider is our use of AI in this context appropriate? And is it going to support our mission, vision, values? And that also will take into consideration what legal regulation might be applicable in that particular region or jurisdiction, as well as what might apply for that specific industry. Now, one of the examples I often share when we talk about this is one of a company or organization that is thinking about whether or not they will, they're wanting to apply AI to start to listen to inmate calls, right? And they want to be able to gather intelligence. But there's an opportunity or a possibility that they might hear something that indicates that an inmate is going to commit suicide. What then do they do? Now, some people might say that's a moral question or consideration. Should we be listening to their calls? Is that privacy? In this case, we want to use this as a value sort of consideration. Well, we go back to the mission, values of the organization. They say that their intent is, or their concern is, inmate well-being. And so if inmate well-being is one of your, priorities, is it okay that you might hear something exposed in a call, even though your intent was to gather intelligence about other crimes externally, perhaps, and not actually respond to that particular inmate or the concern for their well-being? So that's one of the ways in which we start to look at, is this applicable? Is this the best use case? Are we violating something? Is the organization violating something as they consider using AI for a specific solution and not considering, how does that work towards our overall strategy, our overall mission, our values as an organization? And so that's a little bit of a checkpoint there that, given the specific use case or application that an organization might want to do. The next is inclusion. And so you all came to the summit kind of listed in this section in the midst of some of our inclusion and diversity initiatives. And this one is one I think that is challenging for us oftentimes as in technology, and also probably one of the more critical pillars that we consider. One reason in particular, it's because absent of inclusion or the inclusion of diverse perspectives, ethnic backgrounds, people from different abilities, we may be missing something valuable or even missing the opportunity to serve our customer or to respond to them effectively or to meet their needs. One example of this I use when we talk about technology is not an artificial intelligence example alone, but it's a technology one. When we think about seatbelts. Seatbelts had a very purposeful intention in that when they looked at putting seatbelts into cars, the intent was to be able to help minimize impact and harm or minimize the injury and potential death of individuals in a car. When they first instituted seatbelts, those seatbelts were designed according to and based on specifications that would suit men. Why? Because at the time, 70% of car drivers, automobile drivers, were men. So they thought it was great that we could then build and test seatbelts to serve those 70%. The problem with that, of course, is that there were 30% women that drove vehicles as well. And then never mind the other stakeholders, the people that were passengers in the cars, women and children, right? Boys. And so the problem with that is there was an unintended consequence of designing without the perspective or the consideration of that other population. When they first released seatbelts in the 1950s, we actually saw an increase in harm to children and to women. In some cases, even death as a result of the seatbelts and the way in which they constricted and confined individuals. So what did that mean? They had to go back then and reevaluate how seatbelts work. And we ended up transitioning to be able to test seatbelts and design those to actually work effectively for women and children. And then they started to test with dummies that were both male, female, and children's size. So that absence of that perspective, that absence of consideration for that people group or that demographic actually had an unintended consequence. And that's often the case when we start looking at when AI is being applied. Most of the times what happens is not intentional. It's an unintended consequence, perhaps because we forgot the perspective and the voice of those, or we didn't consider other stakeholders, other constituents, other consumers that needed to be factored in. Now, so when we think about inclusion, we're thinking about that in the context of not just are we considering all of the necessary consumers, the necessary stakeholders, but also do we have people all throughout the machine learning lifecycle or the product lifecycle that actually can infuse the perspective and the voice, are thinking about the other customers that need to be considered. And there are a number of ways that could be brought into play. Training and education. I mentioned earlier that part of our work is actually, focused on training and education, because we don't want to assume that everyone knows exactly what to do when we see that there's a problem of bias, or will even know what to think about when we start looking at, what considerations need to be made from a privacy perspective. Oftentimes, people will assume the data scientist has that covered, or the machine learning engineer has thought about that. And there is a responsibility for all of us. I would say all of us sort of broadly, but then specifically when we're talking about product development or designing applications that we can use in security context, there is a responsibility for everyone, throughout the machine learning lifecycle. We talk about like a product manager needing to know and thinking about the consumers, other stakeholders that need to be involved, developing personas that are applicable so that we're thinking about the considerations or the characteristics, the behaviors that are reflective of that particular population or group, right? Then those are things that need to be considered when we annotate data. If we're training a model, are we considering all of those features and factors, or the way in which we annotate the data? Is that being factored into the choice of algorithm that might be used? And then the way in which we evaluate that data or those results. When we go back to testing, are we going back to that same sort of set of criteria, making sure that we've covered off the considerations for those consumers, those personas, right? There is a part and a responsibility that we all need to play, and those people need to be appropriately educated as well. One of the other things that come into play with this also is it's teaching about unconscious bias. Because there is bias that we all have as individuals, those mental shortcuts that we make that help us to be able to navigate things quickly when we're dealing and encountering things. But sometimes those things are informed by stereotypes or missing or inaccurate data. And that oftentimes is infused into our systems. And so understanding that is a part of, training and education and awareness that can come into play as well. Accountability. This is where we often talk about humans in command, how much responsibility or involvement is needed from a human oversight perspective. And so this is often an area where we start to look at what's the risk or the likelihood of specific things occurring that require us to respond in or have additional oversight. So we might use our video conference software, or we're using Zoom and other things like that, and so there is automatic sort of a cancellation of noise, and that's something that's done with AI or or blurring out your background. That's not something that requires human intervention, but in review of other use cases or applications context, there may be situations where we think that it's higher risk and requires more involvement. And we want to have those workflows. We want to make sure people are identified to be able to respond to those occurrences. We want to make sure that they're informed and educated, like we're talking about, so that they're looking at things appropriately as they look to build. Data privacy and protection. So this is probably a little bit closer in line to some of the things that you all are familiar with being in security. And I know you often see a lot in the way of privacy, and sometimes that is, or data protection. That's where a lot of people sit first when thinking about responsible AI. What are we doing with our data? Is the data being used appropriately? Are we securing it appropriately? Have we adequately masked the data such that we can't identify any one individual? Are we using differential privacy, right? What other ML privacy preserving techniques can be applied to ensure that we are using data responsibly and not exposing or violating the rights of any individuals in that data? The other thing that is often considered in this particular part as well is what do we do when we need to contest the use of our data? So in some regions and jurisdictions, contestability is important, right? If I know that my data is being used, or I want to contest the use of my data in a specific algorithm, what does that look like? And how is an organization able to walk that back, remove that data? Or even before we get to that point where the organization has to remove the data, what about an individual knowing that their data is being used and then have a mechanism or a way to be able to actually, request that data be removed, and then the algorithm or the model having to adjust or be retrained appropriately in order to factor that in, right? So those are considerations that come in when we think of data privacy and protection. Fairness, and this is one that I think sometimes is challenging because what is fair in one circumstance or a situation may not be fair in another. And so we look at fairness in the context of the application use. How is it being used and how do we define that? And so this is, to ensure that we're minimizing, unfair advantage or an unintended advantage in some way that could be removed, and also to make sure that there is inclusive representation. Then transparency and explainability. And this is also where we get into a little bit of interpretability. Do we have the ability to understand the way in which our algorithms are designed and actually providing outputs or predictions? And then can that information be used in order for us to have the level or degree of accountability or response that might be needed in any circumstance? So this is the structure. One of the things that it's a little difficult here because I'm not hearing everything, so I'm not sure if Alex had an opportunity to mention. But one of the things that we talk about this is defining an operating model, right? A structure that includes people, process, and technology. What things do we need to do with our people? How do they need to be informed? What roles and responsibilities do they have? What governance structure are we establishing? All to assist us and aid us in being able to manage the potential risks that might come, as a result of leveraging AI. Now we bubble this up a bit and think about, let me see if I can do this. And I want to just double click on inclusion, and I'll talk a little bit about some privacy things related now that we're looking at security. The reason why this becomes important as we think about responding in security issues or incidents is because there are opportunities or there is potential for us to infringe on rights, right? There's an easy way that we start to collect and look at data that the more data that we start to consider, we could end up in a circumstance where we're over or mass surveilling, right, individuals. Is that an infringement on our right? Are there considerations that we need to make now that we're capturing data, we're auditing that data and looking? Now there's there's consideration for surveillance. Are we going beyond a point in gathering this data and using that in ways that actually could be considered, over an abundance in a surveilling sort of way, beyond just what is necessary for us to be able to respond to or reduce risk in our network and our environment. And so some people will think that might infringe on, some civil rights. That might have an impact on privacy. And what then do we do there? And sometimes those are considerations that organizations have to then make as they think about how much do we collect? Where do we collect the data from? How do we, and what ways in which we use that? Other considerations, around either intrusion detection or even denial of service, like being able to respond to that. Can you imagine, for instance, like not having a good context for holidays in certain regions, right? Now that's cultural, but that also, it's taking into consideration things for, certain people groups. This is where inclusion matters, right? And if you're not paying attention to that, what happens if you start to, where you see an uptick in activity at a specific time as a result of a feast or holiday, and that be misinterpreted as a different kind of event, that then you block users, right? Or block access to certain systems. And it wasn't actually a real issue, but perhaps something that was generated as a result of a festival or a season or a time of the year. Those are considerations that, perhaps I don't think about because I don't have those festivals that I uphold or celebrate, or may not have the context of understanding the culture in a specific region, but then will have implications to what happens in our systems. And that perspective, that understanding are things that people from other backgrounds or other communities will hopefully bring into the fold and help us to think about. I think the other thing, when I just think about just like what is normal access, or um, our ability to bring in conclusion, these are some of the things that are listed that talk about the benefits of inclusion. And this is not unique to cyber security or corporate security at all, or technology even for that matter. Some of the benefits of inclusion are things that have been studied over time, and they find that are beneficial to organizations. The fact that when we have inclusion, we have the ability to see greater performance, and they say that organizations that are more inclusive outperform their peers in the same group. That sort of inclusion can help fuel innovation, because we're thinking differently, and those ideas might be sparked or help us to be able to serve and respond to customer needs. There was another study that talked about it being able to help us avoid errors. And in the examples that I was just describing, perhaps help us avoid unintended blockages or denial or removal of access to service, because of the considerations that they would help us to think through, right? So I think we have an opportunity to have much more a sort of complete thought and consideration about those people we seek to serve, or our customers that we want to serve. And that can filter into how we look at, putting in security measures to make sure that we're covering those. This is another side that really helps us go back to what does it look like in the way of benefits. We see working with customers great bit of benefit to the organization when they start to put in an operating model where they have the right governance structure, where they use and leverage things like MLOps as well, and practices to make sure that we have consistency when we're moving things from one environment to the other, or that we have things in place in order to be able to monitor models and understand where they shift and change, and what that might mean for the output in production versus the way in which we trained. We believe that having this sort of operating model actually accelerates our ability to be able to leverage AI in other ways, in more ways. It accelerates our adoption across the organization, in part because I think when we as individuals don't trust something, then we're going to be less likely to want that used in our organization, or even support its use externally. And so when we are building responsibly and building inclusively, we also are building in a way that engenders trust, right? Trust in the technology, a trust in the solutions that we deliver, and ultimately, hopefully, and trust in the industry, because our objective is not that we want to eliminate the use of AI, right? I'm a technologist at heart. I believe that there are great benefits that come from our ability to be able to leverage AI, and we're seeing it help us in being able to solve problems that we were previously unattainable. We're seeing it being able to benefit us when we start looking at the massive amounts of data that is being created with 5G and Internet of Things, or devices on the edge, right? We're collecting so much more than we can consume as human beings. And so we want the benefit of having AI and models in play for us to be able to distill that data, gain insights from it. And again, I talked about being able to shift from being much more reactive to hopefully being able to see in advance of some things and being able to put in, countermeasures. So we want that we want to be able to leverage technology, which means that we have to put the right things in place so that we can gain trust of our peers, our members, our customers, and be able to leverage that technology more in innovation. I, I think the other bit, and we didn't talk about this much, but when we talk about people, is also being able to develop our resources internally. There's some things that teams are going to shift in terms of their focus or not be doing, and now have the ability and capability to do others. And our ability to put in that governance structure, look at the new operating model, helps us to be able to better equip our teams, hopefully upskill them in certain areas and give them other paths, such that they're not entirely being displaced. This operating model is going to help us have the capabilities that are necessary so that we close the gap, that preparedness gap that we were talking about before. And organizations really do have the ability to be able to address the risks. And when we can address the risk, that means we're going to be able to gain greater value from our investment in the technology. So this final slide here was one that was created, and Alex started off with this at the beginning, right? This is essentially, our premise, our core sort of foundation in terms of the way in which we're looking at technology and the advancements of AI and our ability to be able to use that, yes, to be able to leverage it in innovating more, but also to ensure that we're building in a way and we're helping our customers build in a way that actually isn't going to infringe on rights, that is going to respect, the rules, the law, regulation that's necessary, align with organizational values, but then also ensure that we are including and considering those sometimes underrepresented or those that are in edge cases that we may not be considered, and make sure that we're preserving their rights in terms of privacy as well as fairness. And fairness for us, right, is again, ensuring that we can look at the way in which we minimize, unintended or unnecessary harm, but actually drive towards equitable outcomes.
So we'd like to thank you for coming this afternoon. And I just wanted, like Dia said, I wanted to leave you with this. And we want to thank you for joining us. I'm Alex Morrison. You can reach me at lexmori@amazon.com. And we look forward to continued conversations with you. And so you can easily reach out to any one of us, each one of us. And if you have any questions, we can hang out a little bit over here. But please fill out the session survey, because it's really important for us to hear your feedback and to ensure that we are continuing to deliver the content that you're most interested in. So we want to give you a little bit of your time back, and thank you very much for joining us. I appreciate you.